Good morning, everyone. We'll just give people a moment to join the channel and then we'll kick off. All right, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to NDIS Margin Squeeze, preparing for the 2026 pricing arrangement. We're really glad you could join us today. My name is David Hornstein, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Now, while we wait for everyone to join, I thought I'd just kick off with a quick icebreaker poll, which you should see pop up on your screen momentarily, asking how confident are you in your organisation's margins heading into the second half of the year? We'll just give everyone a moment or two to respond to that. All right. Well, wide range of answers there. I think quite a distribution actually between confident and concerned. So I think that gives a great contrast to kick off today. Look, our goal today is to give you a better understanding of how the pricing guidelines are going to impact your organization and how you can prepare going into the second half of the year. So before we begin, a couple of very quick housekeeping matters. Uh, we're going to aim for 45 minutes today. We're usually pretty punctual at finishing on time. We will record this session, so there will be a recording sent to you via email after this wraps up, and we'll allow some time at the end for Q&A. So if you have questions as Kirsty is going through the materials, add them to the Q&A function or the chat, and we will cover them as much as time permits at the end. All right, so time for some introductions. So for myself, by way of introduction, David Hornstein, I'm the CFO and COO at Weel. My background spent just over a decade in corporate advisory, M&A activity at Citi, so working with finance leaders and boards and CFOs on transformative acquisitions. More recently, I've been at Weel for just over 4 years. We provide spend management solutions to businesses across a range of industries, including the care sector at NDIS in particular. Now, I'm not the star of the show. That is Kirsty, and I'm thrilled to bring Kirsty along today to share some of her learnings with you. So Kirsty is a senior manager in business advisory at RSM, and she's going to share some perspectives on what's driving the financial pressure across the sector and what the next range of what the wave of reforms ultimately means for providers. Kirsty, thanks for joining us today. Maybe if you
Thank
could
you.
start by sharing a little bit more about RSM, your role there, and some of the
Sure.
work you do in this
So,
space.
I'll talk about RSM first. RSM is one of the leading professional services firms across the country. We have 32 offices across Australia and quite a number in regional areas. We provide audit, tax, and advisory services. I'm based in Canberra, but I work with providers all around the country, and I've been working with NDIS and care in-home aged care providers since the NDIS was a trial site in Canberra. So I don't want to count those years right at this particular point in time. But most of the work that I do is grounded in a lot of financial analysis and activity-based costing, business transformation, and compliance and operational improvements. I'll talk a little bit more about how we can help at the end, but that's a little bit about me. So,
Thanks, Kirsty. Well, look, we're
yeah,
delighted to have you join us today. We've got a very engaged audience that this is a topic
so
that's
got a lot happening right now.
clearly of interest to
Yeah,
people. So I'm going to hand over to you at this point, Kirsty. I will turn off my camera and then I'll come back at the end for our Q&A.
cool. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the underlying and structural issues around pricing, but more importantly, margin. And also just reflect on the most recent changes that have been announced over the last month, because there is a lot happening. So just gonna, if I can change screens, where are we? Get my thing on the right. There we go. I'll start with an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waters on which we live and work, and pay respects to elders, past and present, as the custodians of their culture and continuous connection to country. Where we are in Canberra is we have the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and in the Ngunnawal language, which they're reclaiming, the word for hello is Yuma. So, as I said, I think the NDIS reforms are redesigning how providers operate. A lot of the big initiatives and the changes that we've seen over the last few years fundamentally impact operations and compliance. So I'm going to set the scene with a bit of market context, talking about the scale and the pressure across the whole NDIS market, talk a little bit about why margins are tightening, reflect on what is changing out of this year's budget and the legislative changes that have been posted last week, talk a lot about where providers lose margin, compliance, and how we can sort of address that at this particular point in time. And that means that you'll be prepared whenever the new pricing guide drops later this year. So to start off with, if you've been following Minister Butler, he'll be talking about the size and scope of the scheme. And we know that they're wanting to constrain the scheme to be it's in the $52 billion envelope, and that the number of participants they want to reduce from 7 at the moment. Back in Q4 it was 739, reduce that to 600,000, which actually, when you work out all of the growth, means that there would be, over the next 4 years, nearly 500,000 people with disability actually transferred to state supports, foundational supports, and Thriving Kids. So we know that there's going to be a very flattening of demand. And that's a really significant change in the market, because over the last 10 years, what we've seen is a very high growth market. This market has just continued to grow, and that has driven a lot of success for providers because they haven't had to chase or compete effectively with with each other. There's just simply been more hours, a lot of hours to provide services in the market, and that demand's been very sustained. But what we've seen in the last couple of years is that profit margins are eroding. So this is from IBIS World, and they have consistently over the last 10 years talked about the sector as delivering between 2, 3, 4% profit margins. And just in the last 12 months, it's now projecting a minus 1.6. And you can see that also echoed from National Disability Services reports, and you can also see that in the insolvency statistics. We can see that the market is really starting to tighten up and really start to become a lot more difficult to operate in. And one of the structural reasons for that is pricing. So we know that the pricing is designed so that most providers must continuously improve just to remain viable. So this is a quote from IBIS World, but it talks about the margin of 2%. And I'll unpack this a little bit later in the presentation, but basically they state that only 1 in 4 providers should be profitable, incentivizing the rest to improve efficiencies in pursuit of these margins. So right before you even open the doors, you are working in a space that is designed for continuous improvement. And if we reflect on just the operating reality of where providers are, we're working in a space where there is cap pricing. It's set to a very low efficient benchmark. There's very high labour intensity and workforce dependence. There's an escalating complexity of compliance, registration, and this has been continually changing over the last 10 years. And what we've seen is policy and funding rules, they change faster than provider business models. Although I have to credit the industry with this, when you think about that there was no such thing as plan management sort of even 6 or 7 years ago, and they're now processing $30 billion worth of claims, across 700 businesses. You can also see that businesses respond very rapidly to the changes in policy and funding rules, but they keep moving the bar. And we know that there's limited tolerance for poor quality, safety, or governance. And so in this kind of environment, we now have a reform agenda that's planning out more ongoing changes over the next 3 years. Um, what we're seeing, what all that really adds up to is that we are embarking on what analysts will call a maturing of the market, but it means consolidation. And we can see that through there's a lot of interest in buying and rolling up businesses. There's a lot of interest in selling. We're also seeing a significant rise in insolvencies and small business restructuring. And these are not isolated failures, they just reflect that structural pressure across the market. We're seeing legacy not-for-profits exit the sector, either through insolvency or through restructuring, or service rationalisation, where they're actually exiting NDIS services. We're seeing this emerging for-profit businesses coming in at the lower end. I've worked with a couple of companies who 3 or 4 years ago were 2 support workers, and they're now running an $8 million business. So we've seen just some incredible shifts and changing, and it's a very rapidly changing market. So why are we seeing this? Obviously, that pricing pressure that I've also talked about. We also have a cost escalation, particularly since COVID. The operating inefficiency is catching up, and we also have governance challenges. So I'll talk a little bit about the policy and pricing reforms. We've had the Getting the NDIS back on track legislation, which was introduced by Bill Shorten. We've had the integrity and safeguarding legislation, which just kind of went through just before all the government announcements last month. And we've now got the latest piece of legislation, which has been introduced last week. And the themes across all of these changes are to respond to the Disability Royal Commission, but also, and fundamentally, they're about controlling and reducing the scheme inflation to below 8%. And the government's claiming this is about long-term financial sustainability. Won't get into the politics of that because I know we all have very strong opinions about the government policy. But what we're dealing with is some very, very structured reform that is targeting fraud, how funding is claimed, pricing, so reviews on price limits and market interventions, plans, how funding is allocated and controlled, what can be purchased, what's allowed to be purchased, and controls around what can be claimed. And quality, governance, workforce, compliance and registration. So we're seeing an enormous agenda. If we look at just what's been announced for the federal budget, and they're calling this a structural reset, it is about slowing growth, tightening controls, and maintaining fairly high expectations on the sector. The government's focus is on long-term sustainability, slowing participant growth, shifting to foundational supports, And but what a lot of this is actually going to mean for businesses is increased compliance and digital controls over payments and reporting. So how you get paid is going to fundamentally change. So the implications that I'm seeing from what's been announced so far is the funding changes. So there's tighter rules for plan funding. They're going to limit plan rollovers, change of circumstances. There will be significant reductions across community access funding. And the minister's been given discretion on groups of funding changes. So similar to what's happening with community access at the moment, the minister will have the power in the future to say arbitrarily, this particular group of supports, we need to reduce these costs and act accordingly. So a lot of the certainty that we had with a plan is going to change. And it's very, very difficult for providers who don't always get to view a plan when that is really the litmus test for what you're being held to be compliant to. It's quite a big area of risk. Claims and cash flow, there will be a 90-day limit on claims. So that means if you haven't claimed within 90 days, chances are you will be unable to be paid. And there will be requirements for all providers to enrol in a claiming system and provide evidence of service delivery with the claim. We don't really know what the detail is on that yet. There will be mandatory record retention requirements for payments, and in the legislation, they are introducing civil penalties for failure to provide on request. In terms of pricing and governance, there will be mandatory registration requirements for at-risk support categories. We know that's already in place for, SEAL and behaviour supports, but I think they're probably going to look at expanding that into other at-risk support categories. They were going to change the way that they commission arrangements for supported independent living, support coordinators, and plan management in this piece of legislation, specifically mentioning plan management to be commissioned. So that means that they'll be placed under a contract arrangement with the NDIA rather than be able to operate as an independent provider. The really interesting thing with pricing is that's going to move to the minister's discretion rather than being managed by the NDIA. That's probably a good thing because it's a conflict of interest for the NDIA, who's responsible for budgeting, to also be responsible for pricing. But it's what the minister then does with that control that we're all interested in seeing. And we know out of all of that, there'll be increased automation requirements for reporting. And while I'm focusing on the businesses, we know, and I'm the parent of a participant who is potentially going to get moved to state supports. So I understand how distressing it is right now for participants who don't understand whether they will continue to be eligible or not. We'll be shifting to foundational supports or thriving kids. And there's a little bit of information coming out from the states, but it's very much unknown. The functional assessments is also causing an enormous amount of concern because we don't know what that's going to look like or how that will affect eligibility or access. And I think the other concerning part for me is that your plan could be suspended or revoked if there's no contact over 90 days. So I think while that is also a measure that could support protection of people who have been exploited, but it also means that for somebody who doesn't answer their phone, they suddenly have their plan revoked. But that risk, all of this, I think, means that they're shifting the risk from government to providers, because providers are the ones that have to be really confident that the plan's still in place, the plan hasn't changed, that they're actually interpreting the plan correctly, and that they can then claim appropriately from the plan. So I think it's it really underscores that operational discipline is going to be very, very important moving forward. So let's unpack the operational reality. What drives success? NDIS is an operating model business, not a demand-driven business. Providers who know their numbers at a service line level, supported by strong digital and human systems. They design the workforce and operations to the funding rules. They make early, sometimes very difficult decisions. They treat governance, compliance, and quality as core business functions, and they're able to adapt continuously and respond to all of the pricing policy and expectations shifts. So I'll unpack a little bit of what we mean by that. So successful providers know their margin. That means you understand the hourly cost to deliver your service, and they proactively manage wages and your wage classifications, staff utilisation, your billable and your non-billable time, your supervision and overhead ratios, shift breaks, costs. They align services to what funding actually pays for. They claim everything compliantly, and they claim everything. I've worked with a lot of providers who are underclaiming significantly and very completely according to the rules. And when we talk about making tough decisions, they exit or they redesign services that don't break even. It's very hard. There's as businesses, we get very invested in the services that we deliver and the supports that we provide. But if they're not funded or you can't get them to break even, you have to change that. And there's other ways. We need to find other ways to be able to fund those services or other solutions that can help fill that gap in the business. Because ultimately, if you lose your business, it doesn't matter how wonderful that service was. If it can't be paid for, it's not sustainable. So let's break down the NDIS price. I'll sort of unpack what all of that means. So when you look at the cost model, and this is the $70.23 per service hour, this is modelled on a SHADS award level of 2.3. They then calculate out the number of days worked versus days paid according to all your leave and sick day, public holidays, and training. They add on all of your salary on costs like your super and your insurance, and they allow 1% for allowances. And that gets you to $50.54. So to put that worker into that job, per hour, it's going to cost you $50.54 before you have a business. They then have 21.65%, which allows for operational overheads. And that's all been condensed, but very early on in the scheme, the assumptions that were built into that were that there was a 70% permanent staff. Your span of control was 15 staff to one supervisor, and your utilization was 92%. So that means that 92% means you're working and you're chargeable 7 out of 7.5 hours a day. They then allow a corporate overhead of 12% on those direct costs, which includes all your operational overheads. And then they allow a 2% margin on the other costs, which is $1.38 an hour out of that. And when we do benchmarking and activity-based costing and we start to break out service prices, often what we'll see is that sometimes your base pay points can be too high. When you look at the average, you're employing too many fours, for example, and so your overall wages are too high. When it comes to salary on costs and super, if you're a for-profit company, it excludes payroll tax. Also GST, but that's less of an issue in the cost model. When we look at the operational overheads, this is where you see a lot of issues. So casual percentages can be a lot higher than the benchmark, and the utilization is often very low. Very early on in the scheme, we were getting utilizations of 30, 35%. Now it really sits around 70 to 80, but getting your business from that 70% to the 90% makes a massive difference in your margin. And corporate overheads, look, the benchmarking for the sector was at 25 to 30%, but there's also a function of scale of the business. So the larger the business, obviously the lower the corporate overheads are, but that is also a key issue. And the important thing to understand, I think, is that cost model is costing everything out, but it excludes compliance costs, auditing and reporting. It doesn't include overtime charges. It doesn't include shift breaks. There's a whole lot of extra costs the business incurs that is not actually factored into that cost model. And the challenge with a 2% margin means that if you have one non-chargeable hour that's worked by a staff member, you need another 50.5 support hours for you to pay for that. So I can't underscore enough how important, when we talk about operational discipline, it's really about ensuring that all of the cost leakage that you could possibly have is all being built in to your business. I've worked with a number of providers who grew a loss. And what that means is that if it was costing you $80 to deliver the service and you're getting paid $70, and they went chasing volume, they actually went from making a $50,000 loss to a $600,000 loss in a very short space of time. So it's very, very important that when you focus on the margin, that you have really good cost discipline. And if you are growing, you really pay attention to what those costs are and focus on reducing the costs so that you can break even faster. Scale can deliver cost efficiencies, but you've got to balance it all out. When we've worked with businesses who are in that sort of 7 to 10 million space, what happens is the cost of implementing a very large corporate structure for that business to actually meet all the compliance requirements and all the other things you need is that often when we're modeling it, you don't go from 10 to 12 million, you need to go from 10 to 20, 25, 30. There's a scale there that we need to factor in. And it's relative to the size and scale of the business. So margin pressure. A lot of these small efficiencies erode the margin. So we know that the cost model increases each year. Every statutory wage and super increases, it's increased by that. But it's not really keeping pace with overheads and operational costs. There's other hourly rates like allied health support coordination that have been frozen for many, many years. And we know the pricing's designed around thin margins. But the other thing that's happening is you've got increasing compliance and audit requirements from the NDIA, Fair Work, Privacy, Security, ATO, And we've got a workforce cost escalation around shortages. And there's also a very significant reform process going on with Fair Work, which is going to change the SHADS award pricing structures. And underneath all of that, we've had the cost of living inflation. So I feel like I'm just giving you all doom and gloom. But this is where margin gets eroded. It's unfunded services, underclaiming, participant budgeting errors that you can't bill and claim because the money's just never been there. All of your wages costs, utilization, overtime, shift break loadings, missed or delayed claims, claim rejections and rework, poor evidence or documentation if you've got disconnected systems, and manual processing errors. So one of the things when you start to say, how do I get to a point where I'm very, very strong with my operational discipline, is to close that gap. So you want to move to a space where you've got integrated workforce systems and you're rostering to your budget. A lot of providers don't roster to a budget, and they're not tracking things weekly like overtime or some of their loadings. And if you're not really focusing on that and managing it, making sure that your workforce is large enough to not have to schedule so much overtime, for example, you need to be ahead of that curve, because once you've spent the money, it's a write-off. We know we have to move towards real-time compliant records, and that's been a very big challenge for a lot of businesses, but pursuing automation and then building those integrated systems means that you will have real-time compliant records. Invoicing, making sure that it's structured and automated and links really clearly with back to your service agreements and all the requirements for invoicing, and claims. So one of the other digital partners we work with is really recommending that providers work to daily claiming. I think that's a really great idea because it actually will impact cash flow and it'll improve your cash flow. But if you have to sort of think what you have to do to your processes to do that, that is the goal. I think you want to really move to daily, weekly, and to have all those claims first time acceptance. And that will ultimately help you build a much more predictable cash flow. So how do we survive and thrive in a continuous improvement environment? There's a lot of themes around at the moment talking about being audit ready. Whether you're registered or not registered, from a financial claiming perspective, you can be audited at any time by the payment integrity team. So you need to treat invoicing and claiming accuracy as a very core financial control. And audit ready means being ready today. So unregistered and registered providers need to ensure that they have real-time contemporaneous records, that if you get a request from the NDIS today saying we're auditing these travel claims, we would like to, you have to send them everything down to odometer records, for them to validate, that particular claim. So you need to be able to send it straight away because they won't pay you until you can send it to them. So make sure that you have a clear link between the plan, the service agreement, service delivery claim, and evidence. It should all be integrated, and ensure that you also have the capability to respond to audit scrutiny. Under the proposed legislation that was presented last week, any provider who fails to provide evidence of service delivery upon request may incur civil penalties and a debt raised for the claim amount under the review. So that's quite a serious implication, that you could end up being fined and have to pay the debt back, have to pay the money back. A little bit of a sidebar into sort of just talking a little bit about fraud. Most compliance failures are process failures. Like, how likely are you to be audited, or how likely is that to happen? Right now, per quarter, the NDIS is getting more than 7,000 tip-offs from providers and participants around financial fraud. They have been steadily investing in that space, and they're now reviewing per quarter around about 40,000 claims, and 80 million are being examined for integrity issues. How do they select the ones to review? They have a risk process. So if you're claiming from depleted plans, if you are continually submitting the same claim for and it's continually being rejected. There's certain high risk supports like short-term accommodation, for example, that where they're reviewing much more intensely. So we know that there's a risk-based process there that they're doing to apply that. So it's really important that you have a lot of discipline around your claiming and make sure that you're not going to trigger anything that will, create more attention by being compliant. So a lot of common examples when they talk about fraud, you've got that organized crime, but this also trails right across the spectrum where providers claim supports that were cancelled, shortened, or never returned. They might claim group supports as one-on-one. They might charge travel for non-labour costs that were not incurred. And fraud can be actually a deliberate measure that's been done by the provider, or it could actually be staff who are claiming things that they shouldn't be claiming. So there's a number of different perspectives on this. But ultimately, what matters is that the claim that you're putting in is compliant. And so at the moment, what we're seeing from in terms of what's being rejected, plan managers will disagree with providers' interpretation of the rules. There'll be insufficient plan budgets. The actual invoice will be non-compliant. It'll have the wrong code or the unit on it. The support's not on the plan or it's on the banned support list. There might be caps. So buried in the operational guidelines, there's certain caps on some supports. And so you might have reached that cap. You might have hit your funding limit as well. Or they might just need additional evidence. So short-term accommodation, for example, they often ask for a lot of evidence to be uploaded with the claim. So it's really just very important at the moment that you get a lot of financial discipline around your claiming. So the sector is going to continue to change and evolve, and successful businesses will prioritise financial sustainability so that they can continue providing services. You want to have your financial discipline and efficiency, good systems, quality data capture, and to have that interoperable. I think there are some opportunities for state and territory foundational services as commissioning arrangements become known. So keep an eye out for what potential opportunities might be available in your local state and territory. It's very important that we strengthen engagement with participants, building that trust with participants so that they will allow you to view their plans and they will work with you to make sure that you can all be compliant is really important, and making sure that their supports are really appropriate according to the rules. And the important thing is getting ahead of the change so that you're planning, not reacting. So our position is that the difference between sustainable and unsustainable providers is really going to be operational discipline. So understand your true unit economics. Ensure that you're compliant on today's rules and know why you're compliant on today's rules so that when these changes start rolling out, it's a lot easier for you to tackle. If you're a business that's been sitting and thinking, oh, I might transition to zero, or I might, onboard Weel, or I might do any of these things, now's the time to do it. I think if you wait, you're going to end up with this snowballing problem that you can't deal with, and you really need to be compliant today. So really look at your claim acceptance rates and delays and manage any of those risks that you've got. Test your operational improvements. So going to something like daily claiming would, is quite a big deal. But maybe you start going to, if you've been fortnightly, maybe you go to weekly, and then you start going to twice weekly. So start to really build and look at what that looks like. Really work through your margin leakage points, and understand, where you could be losing costs. Stress test it and align all your operations with your finance controls. So thank you so much for listening to me. I've just got a little plug for RSM here. I work with a number of different divisions as a subject matter expert, and we work predominantly, we can help you with financial sustainability, strategy and transformation, and operational efficiency and compliance. So thank you.
Thanks, Kirsty. Very comprehensive. I think it's a pretty clear picture you've painted there. The margins are thin, funding is shifting, and it's all arriving whether people are ready or not.
But finance is where it's at. That's what's going to make or break these businesses.
Yes.
As much as we all focus on care and support and all of the wonderful things that these businesses do, if we're going to be around in the next 5 years, to keep doing it, it's really about the finance functions, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah. That sounds good. All right. Well, we've got a few
Yeah.
minutes for questions. So maybe just a reminder to everyone on the line, if you do have questions, drop them in the chat, drop them in the Q&A function, and we will look to pick them up. I've got a couple here, Kirsty, so maybe I will kick
Mhm.
off. Providers that haven't done any prep for the pricing update to date, what is the most important thing they should be doing right now this week?
I would be looking at your claims process and looking at how many claims are rejected, how many claims are actually being processed, and really just sort of manage that risk. And the other thing I would be doing is looking at what is the process around managing payroll, and rostering. I'd be looking at my rostering because those are probably the two really big areas where you've got this leakage.
Nice. Okay.
Mm.
And the adoption to the quarterly funding model, what are you saying here? Has anyone done it particularly well that others might learn from?
Um, yes, we have a business who they were losing probably around 50,000 a month, and they joined with us as our outsourced CFO, strategic outsourcing division. And they, through the process of implementing some very, very good systems, they have been able to turn that business and monitoring, like monitoring all the things I'm talking about. They've been able to um, turn that around to be doing 60, 70,000 a month. And they're probably getting to an EBIT of close to 7 or 8% now, which is huge for the NDIS. So, and that is really about placing the operate, just placing some very good controls around their spending.
Nice.
Mm.
And some of the people on the line will be smaller providers.
Yep.
They may not have dedicated finance teams, or that team may be stretched pretty
Mm.
thin. What's realistic to get in place before July? Where do people go for help? Who can help with this,
Um,
Kirsty?
I would say you can always reach out to me. Um, the other option is to um, look, when I have worked with providers, often what I see is it's they have systems, but they're not necessarily set up properly. So we go in and we try to pull some information out of it. We find that all the staffing information's not in there. And so therefore they're not able to fully utilize the systems that they have, to get the information that they need. So if we want to run a utilization report, for example, we can't. If we wanted to do, if you want to pull some of these metrics out. So I would be saying that, in terms of preparing and getting ready, it's leaning in, go and do some of the webinars, do actually use the system, make sure it's set up properly, because systems all have good and bad features. But if you're not using all the features, then you're not using the full capacity of the system. And so partly sometimes you can feel so lost, but it can really literally be, have we set this up properly? Are we using the full capability of what we have?
Yeah.
And that means you're getting your information together, and you can then actually start to get above it and ahead of it.
Yep. Sounds
Mm.
good. Um, Next question I've got here is, given the increased scrutiny on claims,
Mm.
any advice that you give to organizations that are trying to get audit ready? I guess, what are auditors looking for, Kirsty, in their
Um,
learning?
so so if you get a payment integrity letter, it's quite intimidating, to be honest, in the sense that they will demand everything. The key thing is to respond really quickly to that. So because sometimes it can be what they call a prepayment hold or a post-payment hold. So if they've already paid you, then um, that's one thing. But sometimes they will withhold the payment and they will not pay you until you can satisfy them that that support has been delivered. So I would prioritize that, as a as a really significant issue because they can also then um, hold future payments. So you can end up rapidly snowballing a debt. So the key thing is just to prioritize it. There are some very good lawyers that can assist with the process, but generally it's responding and proving that that payment was valid. The risk is that only 65% of payment holds actually get paid. And the reason for that is because the provider can't substantiate the support. So when we talk about evidence of service, there is a lot of guidance in the NDIS provider website in the provider section, which tells you exactly what you need to be collecting for different types of supports. But generally, you need to be having records that actually show that the support was delivered. You need to supply things like payroll. You'll need to supply case notes. You'll need to supply um, and all the things, all of the expense items, for example, it's really pulling a report out of Weel and saying, here's all the expense items for, you know, these particular supports that we provided. So it's really just making sure that you have the information.
Great. Sounds good.
Mm,
And yes, obviously, we're very happy to talk to anyone
yeah.
about Weel. So thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. Kirsty, I've got one more question for you before we break.
Mm,
So the question is, do you have any advice for service providers with an allied health team that travels to clients for service delivery in schools and home environments?
hmm
The the comment is that they've felt the decrease in pricing for travel claims this year. Any
mm.
comments on that?
Okay, so if you were running an out of clinic model, the actual impact of that 50% price cut is probably around about a straight 15% cut on your revenue. So give or take, how the business is running. So what you have to do then is just be very strategic about when you're using travel. And that means sitting down and saying, well, we don't want to be going to multiple locations at different times. If that was all paid for previously and it's not paid for now, well, then how do we limit the number of locations we're going to? So if you've got 5 clients at one location at a school, for example, then you want to go there for that day and get everybody to booked in for that day. So you need to really look at how you can be more efficient with the scheduling to limit the amount of travel that you can claim.
Nice. Well, thank you
Yep.
for that. I think that's all the questions I've got. So probably a good time for us to
Mm.
wrap though.
Yep.
So look,
Happy
I'm going
to.
to launch a quick poll now. So if today's session resonated with you, you'd like to hear more from Kirsty about the new pricing guidelines, you'd like to hear more from
Mm.
Weel about how we might be able to help with this process or more generally, let us know in a poll that is on your screen now. We'll give everyone a moment to respond to that. And then while everyone's answering that, maybe just, Kirsty, thank you so much for joining us, preparing these materials, sharing these insights with the audience today. Super informative. For everyone that's on the line, we'll be getting a copy of both the recording and the materials out to you later today. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Cool. Thank you.